So a lot of what I've been doing over the last few lectures, you may have noticed, is taking some of the understandings that you learned in the section of the course on microevolution, and then taking some of the concepts that you learned as we've been talking about phylogenetics, and putting them together to show how they can be used to figure out some important things about the evolutionary past. So for example, you've already learned about the relative rate test. To understand that, you first had to understand the molecular clock, which meant that you needed to understand how mutation and drift work to cause substitutions, changes across an entire species. Once you understood how the molecular clock worked, you could understand how the relative rate test is used, together with a knowledge of phylogeny, to understand which lineages have evolved more rapidly during which parts of evolutionary history. I'm going to continue doing some of these same things, showing you today how some of the concepts they've learned can be applied in complicated ways to reveal things about the past. In particular, the past that I want to go into today is the origin of humanity as we know it, not the evolutionary changes necessarily that took place to make us human, but the questions about where human beings started out and how they got to be where they are today. We've gone over basically the whole sweep of evolutionary history, from 3.5 billion years ago, the origin of life on Earth, up to essentially the present day. We haven't gone into a great deal of detail, or your book talks about it a little bit, but we haven't gone into much detail at all about the early history of the lineage that led ultimately to modern human beings. What we're going to talk about today, though, are the species that have existed very recently, the hominin species, modern human beings and our relatives, that have existed very recently, so over the last couple of million years on the planet Earth, and essentially how we know what we know about the history, the recent history of our species. So here are the cast of characters that I want you to be considering during this lecture. Homo sapiens subspecies sapiens means that we're talking about anatomically modern human beings. Basically, when you look at remains of Homo sapiens sapiens, you see a skeleton that looks very, very much like a skeleton of someone who's walking around on the street today. And these skeletons can be found, well, all over the world. Some of them are found in some very early sites. We know them from as far back as about 200,000 years ago. And 1,000 years ago, by the way, is abbreviated KYA. But there were other hominins, other species of humans alive on Earth during a lot of that time span. For example, Homo erectus is essentially a closely related lineage of human beings that was alive on Earth until about 27,000 years ago. Obviously, a lot of the features on the skull, like the brow ridges, the broad jaw with very large, strong teeth, do not look quite like anatomically modern humans, but obviously there's a great deal of similarity. There's another early human species you may not have heard of, called Homo heidelbergensis. It's known from a tremendous range of locations in Africa, in Europe, and all the way out into Southeast Asia. And I'm sure you've heard of the Neanderthals. Definitely related to humans, larger with pronounced brow ridges and a face that's kind of pushed forward like this. Anatomically different, but recognizably still essentially human. They were alive until maybe 28,000 years ago, so very, very recently in geological terms. The interactions among these human species, or subspecies, if you want to call them that, have long been the subject of considerable debate. Where did they arise? How did they spread? Were they totally reproductively isolated from one another? Did they interact at all? A lot of these questions were very much up for grabs because we had very meager fossil evidence. We had enough fossil evidence to know these species existed, but not enough to answer all of our questions about them. And while we'll never really answer all of our questions about the recent evolutionary history of our species, the access to genetic information has allowed us to answer a tremendous number of questions. I'm going to focus on one of those today. We're going to start at about 2.5 million years ago, right around the origin of the genus Homo. That's anatomically modern human beings and their close relatives like Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, the Neanderthals, and so on. One big controversy over the years has been, what are anatomically modern human beings? And there have been a couple of models that have been suggested about how human beings that we recognize today may have evolved. One of these models is what's called the African replacement model. So in the diagrams you're going to see some of the symbols that look like this. Archaic humans, in other words, humans that do not look quite like anatomically modern human beings. And here we're talking about things like the Neanderthals, or Homo heidelbergensis, or Homo erectus. They're all going to be shown in this light tan. Anatomically modern human beings are going to be shown in this darker shade. These blue arrows suggest gene flow back and forth, whereas red arrows denote hybridization, mating between groups that are more distantly related. Here's a phylogeny that basically shows what according to the African replacement model, what happened in the evolution and colonization patterns of early humans. So here at the base of this tree diagram, we're looking at the ancestors of the whole genus. And we're confident that those ancestors arose in Africa, and we're confident that they evolved about 2.5 million years ago. According to the African replacement model, what next happened was that various groups of descendants of this ancestor left Africa. And in different regions, they separated and evolved to become quite different from one another. One branch, for example, became Homo heidelbergensis, another the Neanderthals, and so on. Subsequently, what happened was that there were further branching events, but anatomically modern human beings evolved in Africa. These other archaic human beings were still alive in the world when this happened, but shortly, anatomically modern human beings migrated out of Africa, spread across the rest of the globe, and outcompeted or otherwise supplanted Neanderthals and other archaic groups of people. This probably happened around 200,000 years ago, and it caused the extinction of these other groups of people, none of whom, therefore, are the direct ancestors of any living human being. Okay, so that's the African replacement model. There's another model called the multi-regional evolution model. Again, it starts with the genus of the origin of the genus Homo in Africa about 2.5 million years ago, and then with various groups of descendants leaving Africa and diversifying, becoming Neanderthals, becoming Homo erectus, becoming Homo heidelbergensis, and so on. According to the multi-regional evolution model, though, what then happened is that there was gene flow between all of these groups. So individuals migrated from one place to another. They brought the genes from one population into another, and those genes mingled when those two populations intermated. Those genes were then carried on to other populations with further migration, and so forth. So you have, initially, you have these populations of organisms that look, fairly different from one another. There's the Neanderthals, the Homo erectus, the anatomically modern human beings that were starting to rise, but they're all exchanging genes. And so that gene exchange sort of makes them all look more and more like each other. And throughout this whole gene pool, certain traits are favored. that lead to the evolution of modern human beings. So basically this model says that no, the way that we got modern human beings is because all of these branches were still interconnected, they were still interbreeding, and the whole gene pool changed into the human beings we see today. No lineages went extinct. All lineages are the ancestors of at least some modern humans. So the problem is that there's no fossil evidence which can distinguish between these two models. But we can bring genetic data to bear on these questions, and that's what researchers have been doing pretty much as soon as the human genome was sequenced. Because knowing the human genome means that you can take genetic samples from anywhere in the genome, from any person in the world, and you know that they can be compared. And once you can start doing comparisons of the genetics of people from different parts of the world, you can learn a tremendous amount about the history of the human race and how it evolved. So I want you to take a look at these two models. Again, this is the African replacement model over here on the left, and the multi-regional evolution model over here on the right. I'm going to ask a few questions. I'm going to pose a few questions now, and I want you to really think about them while you've got these two models in front of you. And you can go back and review the details of these models if you want to before you take the quiz. The quiz is going to ask you basically the questions that I'm asking now. The reason I'm asking them now is to give you some time to come up with really good answers for them. So here's one question. You may remember, hopefully you remember, the idea of the coalescent. Okay, remember that anytime you have alleles in a population, and particularly this was relevant for alleles that are changing in frequency due to drift, if you go back in time far enough, at some point in the past, you find one allele that is the ancestor of every single allele in the present day population. Now, there's one thing I didn't tell you about this because when we were looking at the coalescent before, we were just studying drift. But of course, in the real world, these these evolutionary mechanisms like drift, natural selection, mutation, and so forth, they don't happen in isolation. So, for example, anytime that drift is happening, mutation is also happening. And so when you put together the idea of mutations happening together with the coalescent, what you get is sort of like a phylogenetic view of what happens within a population. Let me show that to you. Okay, as an allele drifts to fixation throughout a population, some of those alleles may mutate. And that's what I've shown here with these tick marks. So this was the coalescent. This is the allele that was the ancestor to all the alleles over here in the present day population of organisms. As this allele gave rise to others and they split and gave rise to more lineages, mutations occurred along some of those lineages. And you can see that there's a color change after each one of these mutations to signify that there's been a genetic change, that this lineage right here is different than this one back here. Okay, over time, as that allele, the single allele, goes to fixation, there are going to be all sorts of mutations that arise in each one of these lineages. And at the present day, what you're going to see is a whole variety of different alleles. They're all descended from this one coalescent, but now they look different because each one has inherited mutations that are different from all the others. Okay, the amount of genetic variation that you see in any population, in other words, the amount that these different alleles here differ from one another, is a function of basically how many mutations have been happening since this coalescent. So what you're looking at when you look at any present day population is you're seeing basically all the differences you see among these individuals are there because of mutations that have happened since the coalescent. Okay, this has important implications for these two models in terms of what we ought to see when we look at modern day populations of human beings up here at the tips of these trees. Let's think about a couple of different questions. I'm not going to answer these for you. I want you to think about them and come up with the answers so that you can put those answers down on the quiz in just a minute. One of these models, the African replacement model or the multi-regional evolution model, suggests that the coalescent for all of the alleles at any locus in the human species has been quite recent. Okay, one of these two models suggests that you have to go a long, long way back in time in order to find an allele that is the common ancestor of all the alleles in the human species at any particular locus. So what you want to think about is which one of these models suggests a very recent coalescent, and which one of these models suggests a coalescent that happened a very, very long time ago. Okay, the reason you want to think about this is having a more recent coalescent or a less recent coalescent suggests something about the amount of genetic diversity that you expect to see in a human population. And if you're confused by this question, take this diagram down here and think about, so right now the coalescent is back here, and you can see you've got this range of colors of different alleles in the present day population. Now suppose that the mutation rate here were exactly the same, that you get this many tick marks, looks like about one every step, every generation. But let's suppose that the coalescent was here, or maybe up here, just a couple or a few generations before the present day. If all of these alleles right here coalesce to a single allele right here, just like a few generations ago, would you see more diversity or less diversity here than you see from this diagram where the coalescent is all the way back here? So if I were to make the coalescent much shorter, more recent, would I see more diversity or less diversity at the present day? Okay, another question, which might give you some insight in the sort of patterns we ought to be looking for in human genetics, is that these models differ in terms of who they say split away from the other populations first. So according to these different models, there's some parts of the world where you see modern populations that split away from one another a very long time ago. There are other parts of the world where you see populations that split away from one another very recently. And this could cause differences in what we see when we look at all of the groups of people within a certain region of the globe. So for example, think about if the African replacement model is correct, and we look at all the different groups of people in Africa and compare them to one another genetically, according to this model, what should we see? If we do the same thing, but it was the multi-regional evolution model which was correct, what would we see when we compare different groups of African people to one another? So which modern populations split away from which first implies something about the genetic variation that we should see when we compare different groups of people within a certain geographic region to one another. To give an example of this, say that you have let's say the Dinka and the Nuer are two people groups in Africa. If you compare the Dinka to the Nuer, are you going to see two groups of people that are very different genetically or only a little different genetically? What happens if you say compare people of Scandinavian descent to people of German descent? Okay, how are those differences, the difference between those two people groups, going to compare to the difference between the Dinka and the Nuer? Are you going to see a deeper difference between the Dinka and the Nuer, or you're going to see a deeper difference between the Germans and the Scandinavians? Which of these models predict which pattern of genetic differentiation? A third question. which might help you distinguish between these models. Does either of these models suggest that any genes that first arose in Neanderthals or in Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis should appear in modern human populations? That is, when we sequence human genomes of humans alive today, should we see any sequences that arose in these other archaic human groups? If you have the answers to all of these questions, go ahead and riddle through them and then move on to the quiz. If you've gotten them right, you should have no problem scoring all points on the quiz.